Hey everyone, this is Taehyung. Before we dive in, I want you to imagine sitting somewhere calm for a second. Maybe on your bed, your desk, or leaning back in your chair after a long day. This story isn't pulled from breaking news wires or official statements. It lives in an alternate universe inspired by real emotions, real pressure, and real bonds, but not literal events. A place where feelings speak the truth idols sometimes can't say out loud. 2 weeks ago, I canceled my wedding. Not postponed, not delayed. Canceled. 3 days before it was supposed to happen. Everything was ready. Invitations sent. Outfits fitted. Rings chosen. Families excited. Members supportive. And yet, I walked away. Not because love was absent, but because honesty finally showed up. Let me ask you something before we go further. Have you ever agreed to something massive in your life because everyone around you was already celebrating it, even when a quiet voice in your chest said you were heading the wrong direction? Because disappointing them felt scarier than disappointing yourself? If yes, you already understand me more than you think. Now, let me rewind. 6 months before the wedding broke into pieces, I met her at a private art gallery event in Seoul, owned by a friend of Namjoon. No cameras, no reporters, no noise, just paintings, soft music, and conversations that didn't need filters. She was a psychologist, brilliant, composed, emotionally aware, calm in a way that felt like therapy without an appointment. Within weeks, we were dating. Within months, I proposed. My parents adored her. Her family welcomed me warmly. The members celebrated like they were watching the gentlest era of my life unfold. Hoseok hugged me with that sunlight energy he carries everywhere. Yoongi nodded with approval in his quiet but sincere way. Jimin teased me for smiling too much, but his eyes were happy. Namjoon told me love looked good on me. Jin insisted on planning the details like an older brother who refuses to let anything be imperfect. And Jungkook didn't say much at first, but when he did, it hit harder than any speech at any award show. 3 days before the wedding, after a late night studio session, he asked me to stay behind. His voice was steady but low, like he was placing words carefully on glass. He told me he had watched me slowly disappear while preparing for something that wasn't truly mine. He said it felt like losing a version of me the world would never meet again. He wasn't angry about the wedding. He was afraid of the silence it was demanding from me. He said if I walked into that aisle without truth, I wouldn't just break a promise, I'd erase myself. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. He was right. Not because he wanted to be, but because he saw me clearer than I saw myself. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling with the pressure sitting on my ribs like a second heartbeat. My parents deserved honesty. She deserved honesty. The members deserve honesty. But more than anyone, I deserve honesty. The next morning, I met her. The conversation was gentle but sharp, calm but final. I told her I wasn't walking away from love, I was walking toward myself. Tears fell. Not explosive ones, but the kind that understand instead of accuse. She told me she always knew I carried a second story behind my eyes, one I wasn't ready to tell yet. And she hugged me like closure was a quiet language too. When the members found out, the reactions were exactly who they are. Hoseok cursed the timing. not the decision. Yoongi told me regret is louder than disappointment. Namjoon said identity comes before tradition. Jin stared at me long, sighed, then said pain from truth fades, pain from lies calcifies. Taehyung, he said my own name, like a reminder, I'd rather you tremble in honesty than stand tall in illusion. Later that night, Jungkook found me again in the practice room. No choreography, no music, just mirrors and surrender. He told me he was proud of me, not relieved because the wedding was gone, but relieved because I came back, because he got me back, because the silence didn't win. And even though confusion still swirled in me like smoke in stadium lights, I finally exhaled without hurting. The hardest break wasn't canceling a wedding. It was breaking the version of myself that kept saying yes to the world while saying no to the mirror. And this is where the story begins, not ends. Because Jungkook's next words weren't a question, they were a doorway. A confession heavier than friendship, quieter than love, and more dangerous than truth if left unopened. He said he didn't fear losing me to a wedding, he feared losing me to myself. But what I didn't know yet, what none of us said out loud then, was that the fracture I felt wasn't between love and obligation. It was between the life I was choosing and the person who was silently choosing me back. I still remember the silence after he said that. The practice room mirrors reflected a version of me I barely recognized, shoulders tense, hair slightly damp from rehearsal, eyes carrying questions heavier than choreography. Jungkook wasn't looking at the mirror. He was looking at me, directly, steady, honest, like he had rehearsed the courage more than the words. I asked him what he meant, even though part of me already knew. He took a breath, not dramatic, not shaky, just real. The kind of breath that says someone is about to jump off emotional cliffs without a harness. He told me friendships can wear disguises too. That sometimes we name something bond because calling it love feels too dangerous, too heavy, too impossible under the weight of who we are. He said he didn't realize it at first either. It started as admiration, then comfort, then something that felt like home settling quietly in his chest without asking permission. He said the night I told the members about the wedding, he felt a crack open in him he couldn't explain. Not jealousy, not anger, loss. He said it felt like someone packing the sky before he learned to name the weather. And when he watched me prepare for the wedding, smiling in meetings, choosing fabrics, approving playlists, discussing seating charts, like it was another world tour itinerary, he realized the truth wasn't just mine to face, it was his too. He said he watched me disappear behind the script I never auditioned for, and it terrified him because the version of me walking toward that aisle was a version he would never get to know, never get to speak to, never get to save. He said, love shouldn't feel like extinction. Even when it's quiet, it should feel like arrival, not erasure. And there it was. The confession, not loud like headlines, quiet like impact. The room didn't spin, my pulse did. He told me he didn't want to stand between me and a life choice. He wanted to stand between me and self-betrayal. He said he'd rather carry the pain of truth than attend the funeral of a false smile. My voice didn't break. My certainty did. Because I realized he wasn't confessing to sabotage my wedding. He was confessing to salvage me. That night, The guilt felt layered, like harmonies stacking in a chorus I never intended to record. But relief hummed beneath it too, because someone finally said the part I kept swallowing, the part idols don't rehearse, the part fans sense but can't translate. The next scene in this universe unfolded in the dorm, where the air felt different after truth entered the ventilation. Jin was the first to speak after the announcement settled. He said, "Love that demands silence about self is love built on cracked foundations." He said, "If honesty cancels something, it means illusion built it." Hosok said, "The timing hurt, but the truth healed." Namjoon said, "Expectations make great stories, but terrible lives if they're not ours." Yoongi said, "Regret is heavier than canceled plans." Jimin told me, "Heartbreak is quieter than self-loss." But the weight shifted again when Jungkook spoke to the group, not just to me. He said, "Sometimes love looks like intervention, not confession." He said the fracture we saw wasn't between wedding and freedom. It was between performance and existence. He said he didn't want to be the reason I walked away from a wedding. He wanted to be the reason I walked back into myself. And even though the words stung like emotional demolition, they built something new in the rubble. Something more honest, something unrehearsed, something terrifyingly warm. Days after the cancellation, she and I met one more time. Closure came with clarity, not chaos. She said she always felt a second story behind my eyes, one I wasn't ready to narrate yet. She said I wasn't rejecting love, I was reclaiming identity. She cried the kind of tears that understand instead of accuse. And we parted with gentleness instead of fracture. The members didn't celebrate the cancellation. They acknowledged the return because the story they feared losing wasn't a wedding story. It was mine. In the practice room again, knees meeting the floor, not in choreography, but surrender. I realized the loudest betrayal wasn't disappointing families or canceling celebrations. It was the version of myself that kept nodding at the world while shaking its head at the mirror. And now? Now came the next truth waiting behind Jungkook's eyes, not as sabotage, but as revelation. A doorway shaped like vulnerability, framed like friendship, weighted like love, and whispering a third story I never realized was already choosing me back. The days after the wedding cancellation moved slowly, like a song played at half speed, every beat stretched longer than intended. I tried to bury myself in schedules, choreography, recording sessions, anything that felt structured enough to silence the emotional static in my head. But silence, I learned, doesn't disappear just because you fill the room with noise. It waits. Patient, precise, heavy. Jungkook gave me space, but not distance. There's a difference. Distance abandons. Space prepares. He checked on me in quiet gestures, placing water beside my practice spot without comment, adjusting the studio air conditioning before I noticed I was cold, tapping my shoulder once after rehearsal, like punctuation instead of conversation. Minimal but intentional. The members watched this unfold like supporting characters who already know the twist but respect the pacing. Jin didn't force dialogue. He delivered truth in measured doses, like someone feeding medicine to someone who refuses to admit they're sick. He said, heartbreak is survivable, self-loss is archival. He said, a canceled chapter isn't failure, it's editing. Hoseo kept morale high, but gently. He said healing needs rhythm too, but not choreography. Namjoon offered conversations that felt like philosophy sessions disguised as dinner table chats. He said life choices made for the audience eventually demand refunds from the soul. Yoongi observed like silence was his native language. He said nothing profound at first. Then one night, after a late practice, he said, love isn't always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's the one rearranging the furniture so you don't hit your knees too hard when truth finally lands. Jimin processed emotion like it was a second profession. He said, sometimes people think they're attending a celebration when they're actually attending a moment of self-sacrifice they can't see. He said, I didn't cancel love. I canceled disappearance. Taehyung, he said, my own name. Like a grounding mantra, you can survive anything the world throws at you, but not the things you throw at yourself. That stuck not because it was poetic, because it was correct. One night, after a particularly brutal rehearsal where muscles burned louder than emotion ever could, Jungkook finally spoke again, not to confront, not to comfort, to clarify. He said he had rehearsed losing me in scenarios he never wanted to imagine. He said the wedding wasn't the threat, the silence was. He said he didn't care who stood at the end of an aisle. He cared that the person walking there was someone who still recognized himself. He said he saw me vanish behind obligations slowly, like someone lowering opacity on a layer until the original image is gone, but the silhouette remains. He said love shouldn't lower opacity. It should raise resolution. And then came the next layer of confession, not louder, deeper. He said he didn't know when admiration became longing, when comfort became necessity, when brother became home. But he knew the moment he watched me smile through wedding planning, he realized he was reading from the wrong emotional script too. He said it wasn't jealousy, it was recognition. He said watching me choose silence taught him he had been choosing it too. He said truth arrives like a mic drop only if you've been holding the mic wrong the entire time. My breath caught, not in drama, in impact. Because the twist I expected to arrive like a storm arrived like a hand placed quietly over the pulse instead. He said he didn't want to be the main character in my life story. He wanted to be the character who makes sure the main character survives the ending. He said the wedding cancellation saved me, but it also saved him from naming something incorrectly for too long. He said friendships don't collapse when love enters. They collapse when truth never gets to audition. And this time, the silence between us wasn't tension. It was threshold. A pause before the next act where love stops whispering and starts speaking in full sentences. The aisle I walked away from wasn't a stage exit. It was a scene transition. And the story ahead wasn't about canceled celebrations or salvaged identity anymore. It was about the third narrative none of us had named yet, waiting in the quiet, adjusting its posture, clearing its voice, and preparing to finally say, I'm here, I've been here, and I'm not leaving when the cameras fade. The practice room became my refuge, but also my courtroom. Every step, every breath, Every repetition of movement felt like a sentence being delivered without a judge present. I thought physical exhaustion could act as emotional anesthesia, but truth doesn't care how tired your body is. It cares how awake your heart becomes when the room finally stops moving. The members treated me differently now, not softer, realer. Hoseok stopped giving me morale like energy drinks and started giving it like sunlight through blinds, gentle but constant. Namjoon talked less like a leader and more like someone who had read the emotional manual none of us received. Yoongi kept showing up in silence that felt protective instead of empty. Jimin started calling honesty a survival tactic instead of vulnerability. Jin remained Jin's sharp tongue, warm intentions, impeccable timing. He didn't ask if I was okay. He asked if I was finally mine again. Because okay is temporary, mine is structural. I realized the fracture wasn't just between identity and obligation anymore. It was between the life I had been marching toward and the life that had been quietly pacing beside me, waiting for me to notice it was walking in step. One night after rehearsal, when the building was quiet enough to hear even thoughts blink, Jungkook found me sitting on the floor, back against the mirror wall, legs stretched out like a discarded choreography draft. He sat beside me, not too close, not too far, the exact geometry of someone who knows presence is louder than pressure. He didn't start with poetry, he started with honesty. He said he didn't want credit for the wedding being cancelled. He wanted accountability for the silence being broken. He said he kept replaying the moment I told the group, imagining a version where I said yes and slowly faded behind it like a song mastered incorrectly, beautiful but distorted. He said distortion is noticeable only when you remember the original sound. And he remembered. He said he had been proud of my strength for years, but strength without truth is a performance metric, not a life statistic. He said he didn't want me strong for the world. He wanted me alive for myself. Then came the line that cracked differently, not louder, clearer. He said he didn't speak because he feared ruining a wedding. He spoke because he feared attending the end of me without realizing it was happening in slow motion. He said, love shouldn't move in slow motion when life demands real-time resolution. He said, he didn't know when admiration started feeling like possession of silence too. He said he thought love would feel like fireworks. Instead, it felt like panic when the person who defines your emotional axis is about to rotate out of your orbit permanently. I asked him if he regretted saying it. He shook his head once. No. He said, regret belongs to silence, not intervention. He said honesty costs pain upfront but charges less interest long term. The interest on self-betrayal, compounding and permanent. He said he didn't want to be the reason I walked away from a wedding. He wanted to be the reason I walked back into the story I never rehearsed but had been living between breaths for years. He said the silence between us wasn't a wall. It was a misnamed doorway, and now it was opening. Slowly, but finally opening. I thought after that night at the river, the emotional turbulence would slow down, that the current would soften, that the story would take a breath. Instead, it accelerated like a train, realizing it had been heading the wrong direction and finally allowing itself to switch tracks. The next morning, I woke up earlier than my alarm. My body used to waking for schedules, but this time my heart was the one punching the clock. The wound of the canceled wedding wasn't bleeding anymore, but it was glowing, warm at the edges. The kind of warmth that means something is healing, but also rearranging itself structurally. The kind of warmth that tells you the scar tissue is forming, but the story isn't finished remodeling itself yet. My phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications. Calls from distant relatives who only knew me through framed family dinners. Messages from wedding planners asking about refunds with professional empathy I didn't ask for. A stylist sending voice notes about suit fittings that would never happen. Reporters speculating loudly online in this universe too, building narratives that weren't mine, conclusions I didn't consent to, motives I never drafted. The world was writing stories about me while I was still learning to read the original one I lived. But the one message that didn't come was from Jungkook, and the silence wasn't abandonment, it was architecture. He was giving me space, not because he was unsure, but because he knew emotional clarity doesn't grow under surveillance, even friendly surveillance. It grows in private soil. That day, I met Jin at the dorm. He didn't greet me with questions. He greeted me with soup and emotional confrontation disguised as sibling precision. He said, heartbreak is allowed to ache, but identity is not allowed to starve. He said the wedding wasn't the thing I canceled. It was the version of me that was shrinking to fit into someone else's expectations. He said the pain I felt wasn't because I lost the future. It was because I almost lost a self. And the self always screams loudest when it realizes it almost died unnoticed. Jin said something else too, something I didn't expect but somehow did. He said, love that asks you to shrink is not love, it's negotiation. And the heart should never negotiate its dimensions to qualify for affection. He said Jungkook didn't destroy my wedding. He interrupted my disappearance arc. He said interruption can look like destruction when you're inside it, but from the outside it looks like rescue. That word sat in my chest for hours. Rescue, not romance, not destiny. Rescue. Because romance is glitter, destiny is marketing, rescue is bone level honesty. That night we practiced again, and again Jungkook found me after rehearsal. He didn't bring speeches, he brought buttered coffee and a quiet posture. He sat beside me again. He said he didn't need an answer, he needed honesty when I finally had language for it. I told him the truth had no shape yet, but it was forming. He said formation is not rejection, it's processing. And processing is allowed to be messy, because messy is human, polished is public relations, healed is private victory. He said something else too. He said, I don't want you to choose me. I want you to stop unchoosing yourself. Because the moment you stop doing that, you'll finally be able to see clearly who actually belongs in your life, not as a replacement for her, not as compensation for pain, but as alignment for identity. He said alignment is quieter than heartbreak, but louder than regret. He said alignment is the only thing love should ever ask for. The days after Jungkook's confession started to feel like a slow psychological reconstruction. Not the kind you can track in hours, but the kind you measure in breaths you didn't realize you were holding. Every morning carried the same question, but the weight of it shifted. It was no longer, what do I do now? It was, why didn't I ask this sooner? The fracture inside me was no longer sharp like broken glass. It was smoothing into something more dangerous, more honest, self recognition. Recognition is the point where you stop calling pain your enemy and start calling it evidence. Evidence that you lived, something that mattered, evidence that you almost signed away a life you couldn't afford, evidence that love without compatibility is beautiful math that still ends incorrectly. I started showing up at the studio again at ungodly hours, not because the schedule demanded it, but because my heart needed motion to translate emotion into something that didn't suffocate me. The members didn't hover anymore, they just anchored. Anchoring is different from hovering. Hovering asks if you're okay. Anchoring says, I'm here even if you're not. And that was what I needed, witnesses who didn't require language, presence that didn't demand performance. One evening, Namjoon found me sitting in the lounge, staring at the floor like it was a lyric sheet written in a language. I almost spoke fluently. He didn't give advice, he gave observation. He said the heart often mistakes momentum for certainty, that people applaud direction, not accuracy, that I wasn't walking toward a marriage, I was sprinting away from confrontation. Confrontation with the self is harder than confrontation with the crowd because the self knows all your unscripted lines. Namjoon said, love is not a finish line, it's a mirror. And if the mirror makes you unfamiliar to yourself, you don't need more time. You need a different reflection. That night, Jungkook texted for the first time since the river. Short, simple, honest. He asked if we could talk, not because he needed closure, but because he needed continuity without distortion. We met at a late night cafe near the Han, quiet enough to hear sincerity but loud enough to hide vulnerability from strangers. He sat across from me, hoodie up, hair slightly disheveled, eyes steady but tired. He said he didn't want me to respond emotionally, he wanted me to respond structurally. Did his honesty shift something inside me? Yes. But shift is not permission to collapse into conclusions. He said conclusions should never be drafted by guilt or fear, only clarity. And clarity had to be mine first. I told him I wasn't angry, that his words didn't destroy me. They interrupted a version of me that was already cracking under expectation that I didn't realize I owed. He nodded slowly, stirring his coffee like he was mixing emotion with patience. He said bravery is not the absence of trembling. It's the decision to speak even when your voice shakes like a live mic catching a heartbeat. He said he didn't speak to claim me, he spoke to return me. Return is not romance, it's revelation. And revelation is the point where the story stops belonging to silence. He said he didn't want to be chosen as compensation for pain. He wanted honesty to finally have breathing room between us because love that suffocates is tragedy. But love that waits, that's possibility, not pressure. And possibility is the only thing strong enough to hold truth without demanding it perform. After that late night cafe conversation, something in me began to stop resisting. Resistance is exhausting, but acceptance is terrifying because it demands you stay awake for every emotion you use to numb with excuses. I didn't text Jungkook after that night either. Not out of avoidance, but incubation. Feelings need darkness to develop their first shape. Under direct light, they flatten into answers too quickly. The next few days, I watched myself carefully, like a patient reviewing symptoms without diagnosing prematurely. The problem wasn't love, the problem was alignment. I had loved her, but I was warping myself to maintain the illusion of fit. Fit is easy.